Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. I'm really looking forward to having this discussion today. Our guest, again, is Abdaljawad Omar. He's a writer, analyst, and lecturer based in Ramallah, Palestine. He has written extensively in Arabic, in English. He has contributed to Electronic Intifada, Ebb Magazine, Material, Mondoweiss, Rusted Radishes, and other outlets as well. This is our 17th conversation over the last 15 months. We have them all in a playlist you can check out in the show description. Also, just want to note, I used a background photo that was from a screenshot taken from a video by Mustafa Musalam. So there's a link to a GoFundMe for him in the show description. He's a photojournalist in Gaza. And so anyways, if folks would support him in whatever way they can, I would really appreciate that. And I also included a link to the Samir Project. I think it's important that we continue to support people in Gaza, even in this ceasefire. And we'll talk about that and talk about what's going on now and what we can maybe think about as possibilities for the near future today. But it's going to be still urgently required that we support folks on the ground in Gaza for sure. And yeah, good to be with you all this morning. Take a moment and like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. We're like 700 folks short of getting to 10,000, which will be a cool milestone when we get there. So much appreciated to all the folks who subscribe. And then share it with your Nana who's unlearning her boomer Zionism, or your friends or your comrades or whoever. I'm sure it'll be a very worthwhile discussion today. So without further ado, I'll bring Abdaljawad to the stage. Good to be with you again, my friend.
Thanks, Jared. It's great to be with you as well.
Yeah, good to be with you and have something that we can talk about that is, there's some positive things that we can talk about today. I know that you're thinking about, what this all means, and disentangling, as the title suggests, the concepts of catastrophe, which is very real. Obviously, the catastrophe that people in Gaza have experienced, and the total destruction of so much, history, culture, civil institution, housing, and so on. But it's not defeat, right? And so just start us with where you want to begin.
Well, first and foremost, it's of course quite a relief that we're not waking up to daily massacres, although only yesterday in the West Bank there was a massacre in Tamun area, which is close to Jenin, or between Ramallah and Jenin, and it's 10 people were martyred in the air bombardment. So, like everything else, Palestine, you never really truly have a ceasefire. So the war continues in different guises and forms, and this genocidal desire on the part of Zionism and Israel to basically cleanse Palestine out of its indigenous inhabitants and replace them with Zionist settlers still continues in different forms. So, but at least this, pulsion of massacres that, at the end was almost or nearly not only permitted to go on, not only given the weapons and the flow of arms to continue by the West that supports Israel, but also in many ways became almost normalized in the lives of millions, even those who were looking every day towards Gaza. Because after 15 months of witnessing the horrors, these horrors become part of your daily life and routine, part of the habituation to them. And it's quite a relief that we've now, at least in these days, are not waking up to another horrific stories and corpses and hearing the news of people being killed without any form of mercy. So that's on a personal level. I think most of the people are relieved for that. And it's also significant to speak about the success of attaining a ceasefire, and this is part of a wider discussion about the futility and efficacy of resistance that is going on, whether in Palestinian intellectual scene or maybe also to some level across various intellectual communities as well, whether Tufan al-Aqsa was worth it, after the total destruction of Gaza, etc. But for a while there, at least for a couple of months, by the end of or before the ceasefire commenced, I think many intellectuals, analysts were pointing out that this war might never end, or there will not be a stop and a halt in the form of destruction, that we'll see settlements coming back to Gaza as part of what it was called then the General's Plan, which was devised by Giora Eland, who's an Israeli general, which called for the cleansing of North Gaza and the establishment of new settlements in the north. But also hidden within all of this rhetoric and discourse within Israel was also this kind of desire or goal of seeing Gaza's population being ethnically cleansed, thrown into Egypt. We recently heard the statements of your current president in the United States, Donald J. Trump, who said that he wants to, convince or pressure Egypt and Jordan in accepting hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, even plans around consulted with Indonesia and Albania and other places that might take Palestinians, according to these statements of his. So that was the goal from the outset, and with a ceasefire, at least that goal finds a bit of difficulty in actually being materialized in reality. It doesn't mean we're completely out of the danger zone, and I'll speak to that a bit later. But at least at this specific point, the ceasefire in of itself is an accomplishment, and it's an accomplishment because it ceases the massacres, because it forces Israel to withdraw from the area that separates the north of Gaza from the south of Gaza, or Wadi Gaza, which is this area that Israel has called now the Netzarim corridor, and built there what looks like a permanent but also not very permanent military base that cuts Gaza into a half. And because we're seeing also the release of Palestinian prisoners who've spent decades and years behind bars, many of whom would not have seen the light of day if it weren't for this ceasefire and prisoner exchange agreement that has been agreed between the resistance in Gaza and the Israeli negotiator, mediated by Egypt and Qatar. So Egypt and Qatar and the United States, of course. So yeah, that's the picture. Why is it an accomplishment? Again, because it diffuses, first of all, these plans for settlements, at least makes them much more harder to materialize. It enables Palestinians to return, as we saw with the flood of return from the south and central parts of Gaza to the north. Around 500 or 600,000 Palestinians have already moved from the south and central areas to the north. And at the same time, we're seeing at least a prisoners exchange agreement, which is releasing significant prisoners, and also, more importantly, prisoners who've spent years and decades behind bar coming out after this agreement. However, having said that, this is a fragile agreement. It's a fragile agreement, meaning that there's three areas of strength for Israel within the agreement itself. First of all, the fact that it's a phased plan, which means that at any point, based on any infractions, we could see a return to fighting or violence. Specifically, or more likely, that type of violence would be more, remote form of bombardment through the air or standing firepower. I don't see necessarily Israel returning with its armed forces deep within Gaza, but that's also a possibility. So it's fragile because of that phased nature of the agreement. Second, because Israel continues to be driven by right-wing fascist agenda, embodied by people like Ben Gvir, who resigned from the government, but Smotrich and Netanyahu, and who, if they have the opportunity to still go back to war, to still accomplish ethnic cleansing, to still rebuild settlements, would, of course, attempt to do that. However, having said that, and because of, or let me just expand on that a bit more. The other important point here is that Israel will use this ability, or this phantom ability, to return to fighting, to also pressure and squeeze more concessions from the Palestinian resistance in the negotiations that would commence on the second phase and the third phase throughout this war. But also, and what is most important in all of that, is that it could also lead this temporary halt in in the genocidal war that Israel has launched, to still more significant political concessions on the part of Hamas moving forward. So it's early to also assess defeat and victory in these terms, because rebuilding Gaza could be contingent on Hamas abdicating resistance. We don't know what will happen in the near future as negotiations continue, and Israel still has a lot of cards of strength that will help it throughout these negotiations, even if it doesn't return to the war. But in many ways, at least, stopping the war, giving a halt, releasing prisoners, and fracturing Israel's total victory narrative are successes that should be placed front and center in our analysis of the ceasefire and how it came about. And it didn't come about only because of American-Israeli disagreements, or because Trump wanted to end the war. It came about because Israel was facing a long-term guerrilla force that is highly committed, that was able to inflict a lot of damage on Israeli troops, on Israeli equipment within Gaza, and that has sustained a guerrilla campaign for the past 15 months, and specifically in the past 6 months, even within the north of Gaza, by which more than 50 soldiers were killed since October, for instance, until the signing of the ceasefire agreement in North Gaza only. So there has been this concerted effort by the resistance. It still held the Israeli captives, and Israel couldn't reach these captives. It risked a lot, even if they wanted to reach them, because it might end up killing many of them in any operation to release them. And that's why we're also seeing a prisoners exchange agreement, because of this intelligence and operational failure to release prisoners without an agreement with the Palestinian resistance. So all of that, is part and parcel of why Israel chose, I think, to sign this agreement. It needed its prisoners back, and it couldn't sustain the war efforts for the long term. And it started to lose some of the diplomatic and political backing for a continued, never-ending war in many of the West capital, and of course among many of the Arab ruling classes that wanted to see some sort of end of this war at this particular juncture. And it also comes after 15 months of support by various forces in the region, including from Lebanon, the Lebanese resistance, that offered at least 14 months of sustained fighting with Israel on the northern borders as part of backing up the Palestinian resistance in the wake of October 7th. And it also came as a result of some groups in Iraq and others in Yemen, of course, playing an important and fundamental role in sustaining a regional dimension to the ongoing genocidal war in Gaza. So this is the picture as it looks right now, Jared. To your question, though, which is disentangling defeat from catastrophe, I think it's one of the most problematic, I think, for me, concepts in Palestinian history is the concept of Nakba. And the reason for that is because I think that Nakba has almost confused within its field of, within these words that are closely tied to it, both the disaster, um, both the ethnic cleansing campaign in 1948, and the idea of political military defeat. So there's different levels to how we read catastrophe, and Nakba is like a catastrophic defeat, no? And it's not only, a term that is attempts to signify a natural disaster, or a term that attempts to signify it speaks quite directly to this mix of this immense event where an earthquake happened that changed the foundations of life, and that's why you have a disaster or catastrophe. And at the same time, it talks about political, cultural, and military defeat, all in the same phrase. And that condensation of the term Nakba into these different elements altogether has basically made us very intellectually lazy in Palestine in various ways by confusing disasters, if you want, that also have a political background, like the disaster of destroying Gaza in the past 15 months, that Israel has successfully been able to inflict. No, and this is important because from a Palestinian point of view, we've been looking at Israel being unleashed with all of its power, whether in the West Bank, but of course for those in Gaza, it hits harder on a daily basis, on an intimate level. Of course, the loss, the destruction of their homes, the loss of many of their relatives and friends and loved ones throughout this war, and for the Palestinians looking at this infliction, this deliberate strategy of destroying the city, destroying the homes, rendering it or attempting to render it unlivable, without any real repercussions on Israel itself. It was only backed diplomatically, legally, politically by the mainstream media. There was a lot of protection surrounding what Israel is doing, a lot of protection surrounding its war crimes, and still, the dominant frame in the world is we need to give Israel as much leeway and space to commit the crimes it has to commit, at least in the eyes of the empire, so it sustains itself and reminds the region that it's the master of this region. No, and from a Palestinian point of view, we've seen monstrosity. We've seen this will of monstrosity on the part of the Israeli and the Zionist regime, but at the same time, the backing from the empire, and at the same time, no end in impunity, at least a significant end of impunity on the level of policymakers. I'm speaking, of course. On the same time, we can speak about how Palestine have won the hearts and minds of many in the world, and among many of the peoples of the world, including in the global north, or whatever we want to call it. So that's one of the pictures. That's a success, and it's a failure at the same time for Israel. So it's a success because it's unleashing that much power without consequences, shows you can get away with anything. It's a failure because unleashing that much power and force and violence also provokes people into disgust, provokes people to take positions, to continue this discussion for 15 months. It changes minds, it changes hearts, it forces people to recognizing that there's a fundamental problem with Israel, with its colonial strategy, with its violence, with its construction, and all of what comes with this kind of intensified forms of violence. But from our perspective, we've seen this being unleashed, and we see the disaster in Gaza, the total destruction of entire neighborhoods, or most of the built area of Gaza. People returning from the south in this flood to the north of Gaza Strip, but returning to ruins. Of course, it's a political statement before anything else. It's a statement that we will not leave Gaza. It's a statement that we want to rebuild Gaza. It's a statement that people want to still struggle against and make sure that they are part of also breaking Israel's plans and goals and attempts at the annihilation of the Palestinian people, and specifically in this case, the Palestinian people within the Gaza Strip. But people were returning to ruin. So a lot of the discussion in Palestine, for example, today, is that a lot of people will point out to the destruction, to the ruins, to the fact that Israel got away with what it wanted to inflict without much repercussions in terms of policy change or policy direction, specifically within the imperial managerial class, and will say this is why Tufan al-Aqsa is a political defeat. That's the basic argument for many in Palestine and some of the intellectual class in Palestine. Of course, a lot of it is politically motivated, meaning that a lot of people who are arguing this are either from opposing forces to Hamas, so they're from Fatah, or they're leftists who dislike Islamists, or who are people, of course, that have their own, let's say, political affective biases when it comes to assessing this war. It doesn't mean that I don't have my biases, but everybody has his own biases, his own way of looking at things, things that he emphasizes or doesn't emphasize. But that's part of the discussion, this kind of dialectic of futility and efficacy surrounding Tufan al-Aqsa. And they're pointing to the catastrophe and saying because it's a catastrophe, it's a Nakba, like the Nakba in 1948. So, or even in some instances with some people, with some hyperbole, it's even a worse Nakba than the one in 1948. So there is that kind of conceptual confusion between disaster, which nobody can deny, because what happened in Gaza and what continues to unfold in Gaza, and what is still really unknown about what unfolded in Gaza and still not really made into the public eye, at least more thoroughly, tells us as much, that there's a real disaster, there's a real catastrophe in terms of everyday life, in terms of the economy, the infrastructure, the urban layout, the killing of tens of thousands of people, the maiming of also tens of thousands of people, the injuries, the diseases, the health care system, all of these foundational bricks in any, if you want, urban life in the modern and contemporary world that we live in, that have been reduced to their bare minimum or have been actually destroyed. Which also still, and this is another point that we should place front and center, is that it means that the struggle over Gaza and its future, whether politically, whether in terms of people's ability and resilience to remains a question. It's not, a done deal. Not only because we could see a return to war, but also because the very fact, and this goes back, Jared, to what you were saying earlier, it's now that we need to increase our support for the people in Gaza, whether it's materially, financially, whatever, in whatever possible way we can, because this is the struggle now. It's the struggle to rebuild, the struggle to sustain resilience in Gaza, specifically because that is the major political fight that is long-term and that will not see a lot of people on the news. It's not going to be, breaking news all the time. Not all of these exciting, spectacles that will happen that will draw people's attention, but it's that very exact moment that we need to let's say, increase and intensify our support in whatever shape and form people can or have the ability to do so. So that's that's a picture. Now I lost the train of thought. I've been talking a lot, so you can interrupt me or
Yeah. No, thank you. I appreciate you laying all that out. I think it's all really important context. I think on one point, so obviously I totally agree. Palestine becomes the way that we see that, the so-called liberal rule of law world order, right, that it's a farce, that imperialism trumps these things, right, and that Zionism is not held accountable, for these things. And at the same time, there's a little bit, you talked about what they got away with, and also even the term disaster to some extent. I mean, again, like my problem with the word disaster is the kind of naturalization, which is what you were getting into within the Nakba term, this conflation of something that is equivalent on some level to like a natural disaster, right? And then on another to defeat or, um, and, you know, international law and things like that are not frameworks that I think have, they're full of their own hypocrisies, right? Is I guess one way to put it. But nonetheless, like we saw 15 months of war crimes, unfolding every day. And I think the question of accountability is one that is not going to be immediately resolved. And that's part of the problem also with these international orders is that they don't have like quick enforcement, kind of mechanisms. And so it's going to be a political struggle. I think an ongoing political struggle around questions of accountability. And that's also going to have military elements. It's also going to have, I mean, there's a lot of factors there over time. But I guess what I'm saying is that I think important in understanding something as a disaster is that the disaster has an author, and that you, I guess the ultimate question of accountability for the state of Israel is a long-term one, and whether, as it is, and it's intrinsically tied with Palestinian liberation, and it's not something that I think you sort of noted early on with Tufan al-Aqsa that this operation wasn't going to be the ultimate resolution of the Palestinian question, Palestinian liberation, but that it broke the order that existed. It shifted. It deformed was the term that you used. And so I know that you're just sharing a lot of the different analyses that you're hearing, and you're thinking about these things and trying to intervene. But to me, I'm not sure yet what Israel has gotten away with. I mean, I know what they have done, right? But whether they get away with it is, I think, a longer term question.
No, I mean, I agree with you. I don't think we can. Again, this is a ceasefire, and it could be temporary. It's fragile. It's not necessarily a long term solution to anything. But also the questions that arise from this moment, as we move forward, are still, again, everything is still open. I mean, I don't think this historic moment has landed. If you want, I mean, I don't know if it ever lands, but I don't think it ever land, and it could actually, what we've seen in terms of at least the end, whether temporary or more permanent, of this war in its more intense, violent form, does not mean also that we don't see, for instance, in the next decade, Palestinians living in Gaza but slowly, or people not being able to live in Gaza, or because the foundations of the destruction making it unlivable has already been created. So there might be a long-term strategy that undoes life, that undoes life in Gaza in ways that are much more silent, incentivizes and disincentivizes people based on economic rewards if they leave, and perhaps poverty and ruins and lack of essential services if they remain. So there's a lot of there's a layered level here when it comes to thinking of this moment, whether if Israel really got away with it, whether Israel as an idea politically, historically, has failed and crumbled, and we're seeing slowly also the internal dynamics within Israel shift slowly, as many people in Israel also find less hope in the future around the state and its continuity and its reputation in the world, and opt also to leave in different ways. One thing that is notable that we can just mention is that the fact that Palestinians have returned to ruins, while still many Israeli settlers have failed to return to their homes and houses and settlements on the border areas with Lebanon or in the south, which tells you about the different relationship that people have, first of all, to land, to their ties to this land, but also more importantly, to the way they look at the state and what it should offer them before they leave to do their functional role within this society that is based on settling, based on, expansion, and the way these settlers look at themselves as, frontier settlers that are supposed to protect the state, provision it with the ability to control borders, and at the same time protect it from, the barbarians, between quotes, on the gates. So that's a level of also the differences between, at least us and the Israelis and the relationship to the land that I think is important to note. People returning to ruins, also in southern Lebanon, where we've seen Lebanese villagers who hail from the south return by the end of the ceasefire, despite Israel wanting to expand its presence in Lebanon for another 2 or 3 weeks. And we've seen themselves, and we've seen at least 20 or so people martyred also in their attempt to return to their villages. And many of these villages were actually liberated by the bodies of people wanting to go back to these villages, even though they're in ruins as well. So that's just a different picture, between the settler, the ties to the land, and at least the Palestinians who want to be and want to remain and understand that their sheer presence is a political statement. This is one of the best places to find meaning, if you want to find meaning in life, because just by being and breathing, you have some sort of existential answer to the existential questions that you have, including that your sheer presence disturbs the gaze of the settler, or at least makes them feel that their project is incomplete, and that the foundational violence that gave way to the rise of their state has not really been able to retroactively legitimate itself completely. So that's part of the story here. But I think that in my earlier statement, I lost the train of thought. But in my earlier statement, what I was trying to say conceptually is that one of the problems in the intellectual tradition in Palestine is this kind of conflation between catastrophe, disaster, and defeat. And not only because of the authorship dimension, which is important. That's why I insist, for instance, on saying the Israeli genocide, or, although it's not completely a correct term, no, it's not an Israeli genocide. It's not a genocide against Israelis, but it's an Israeli authored, genocide. So there's a problem with term, or Israel's genocidal war, So I always use that term as a means to try and emphasize that there's an author behind this genocide, specifically when mainstream media is making quite a lot of effort to say Palestinians are dying without, an author, or without a force or a power behind the killing of Palestinians on, that we have seen go on for the past 15 months. But I think what is fundamental is that in this intellectual tradition, these terms were just conflated. Disaster, catastrophe, Zionism, and its success, at least in the early days. And at the same time, defeat as a political fact, if you want, or defeat on a military level, or even a cultural level. And if we return to the 1948 era and afterwards, Constantin Zreik, who was one of the first people to coin the term Nakba, also understood defeat on a cultural level, on a civilizational level. It's not only a defeat in terms of that the 1948 or the 1947 to 1949 war, we lost on a tactical level. We lost in terms of military capacities, availability of arms, for instance, or the ability to organize an armed force that can protect the villages. There was no military reading, if you want, of the defeat itself. Arabs mostly understood, the Nakba, and by large also a lot of, the intellectual tradition in the region understood the Nakba as a cultural defeat. It's a sign of a cultural lack among the Arabs. And a lot of the Arab and intellectuals within that era would speak to that cultural lack, whether it was science, rationality, progress, and all of these kind of enlightenment, values that the Arabs need to adopt in order to confront this advanced Western civilization, in which Zionism is one expression, so they understood, and a lot of Arab intellectuals, whether they were Islamist revivalist types or Arab nationalists, tackled the issue from a culturalist, if you want, lens. And that's one of the problems of even how we read the Nakba, no? And on some level, even contemporary era, that remains the fact. There's a lot of, if you want, self-lamentation against ourselves, a lot of Tufan al-Aqsa is an emotional act. There was no real calculation strategically of its concept. For instance, people speak about the decision taken to fracture the regime, the colonial regime around Gaza, and destroy Israel's invincibility in ways that take us back to that the Arab lacks a sense of rational thinking, that we're emotional, that we're driven by desires, that psychic elements drive us, not our mind and ability to control these psychic drivers, if you want. And it's a very common form of discourse. It's almost populist. No, I mean, I'm not talking about that in terms of people just reading Tufan al-Aqsa, but it's part of the common, if you want, inferiority complex that people lament all the time, in which also colonialism bases itself, and a lot of people adopt, is that we're backward, we're culturally insignificant, we're lacking, we're. And the intellectual discourse in the Arab world, when it came to even in Nakba itself in 1948, emphasized or intensified that type of reading. And again, you would hardly find any military assessment of what happened between 1947 and 1949. It's either cultural, and in the 1970s and 80s, some leftists start to look at it from a more economic point of view, looking at the Arab bourgeois as the problem, and looking at this kind of leadership class that leads the Arab world as being the problem that was unable to really break from colonial domination. The bourgeois continued to be complicit with the imperial core, being this kind of comprador class, and in between, it did not play its role that it should play historically in developing its own societies. That the Nakba is also a sign of the malaise in if you want, in the bourgeois classes, and so you start to have a bit of shift with people like Mahdi Amel in Lebanon and others towards this kind of theorization around that the problem is not cultural or civilizational, but the problem is perhaps economic. But still, this kind of military dimension was also not there, about victory and defeat, and even looking at it, perhaps it wasn't total victory even in 1948, because a lot of people remained. The West Bank and Gaza was not, completely dominated for whatever reason, and looking at other dimensions, including, betrayal and along those lines. So Nakba became this term, this all-encompassing term, where it connotes catastrophic defeat. It connotes a sense of shame in being subjected to this catastrophic defeat. It's explained largely on a culturalist level, and even with other vintage points being placed front and center, it confused, in my opinion, defeat with disasters or catastrophes, ones that are inflicted by an agent, and in this case, Israel, as you correctly, pointed out. But, so it confuses us because you can still have massacres, you can still have disasters, but you don't necessarily have a political military defeat, no? And this is one of the elements. I mean, the disaster itself could turn into a defeat, could turn into even a total defeat. It could turn to people, as I said, in the next years, in the long term or medium run, moving away from Gaza, for instance. I wouldn't wager on that because I have, maybe it's a leap of faith on my part, but I have faith in, the Palestinian people that they will not leave in their millions outside of Gaza. Maybe, tens of thousands will leave, but we will not see numbers that will, completely change the fabric and demography of Gaza irreversibly, at least. And in many ways, that confusion is one that, in a lot of the kind of intellectual political assessments currently is completely being confused. And I think this is why we need to disentangle these two terms. You can still have a catastrophe, you can have the destruction of a city, you can have Israel preparing the ground for ethnic cleansing. You could have, the Roman emperor, in this case, Donald Trump, saying that he wants to move Palestinians out of Gaza and perhaps also out of the West Bank. And you can have the discourses coming from the right-wing fascists and settlers like Ben Gvir and like Smotrich, who want to see settlements back in Gaza. But, there's still a struggle of wills. And in the struggle of wills, Israel blinked first. It wanted the ceasefire. It asked for it by the end, and it went back to signing a ceasefire agreement that was already agreed upon in December of last year, if not May of last year. So that is the fact of what happened, and it couldn't really continue with this never-ending war for two reasons, as I said earlier. The first is the return and the necessity of the return of the prisoners who were becoming a large part of public opinion within Israel that wanted to end the war. And the second is, the long-term guerrilla campaign that was inflicting on Israeli forces a lot of havoc and destruction in its operations, whether in the north of the Gaza or also in the south, in Rafah and other areas. So this is the fact, and I think that confusion, that's what I'm thinking through here, is important, because on some level, Jared, we had theorizations that also turned Nakba into a structure. So we live in the structure of the Nakba. We live in the horizon of Nakba. We live in, and that might be true. I mean, if you think about it, if we're going to take, settler colonial studies as one paradigm, settler colonial studies kind of emanates from the will and perspective of the settler, at least the one that was devised and refined by Patrick Wolfe in Australia. And it reflects what the settler desires, what the settler wants, what form of structure he places that ends up, through this kind of logic of elimination. Patrick Wolfe talks about, settler colonialism as a structure, not an event, although it's also an event, etc., etc., etc. But it centralizes the settler's will, the settler gaze, the settler's desires, the settler's psychic investments, and it kind of forgets that there's a plot in settler colonialism, and that plot includes also indigenous resistance to it, or it doesn't emphasize it enough, if you want. And I think one of the elements here is that, a lot of Palestinians, when they talk about, for instance, an ongoing Nakba, they are speaking about this initial foundational event like 1948, which is important, which is the ethnic cleansing of 400 villages, turning hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into refugees, the construction of the state of Israel as a bulwark of imperial militarism in the heart of our region, as the bull that would keep everybody at bay. And at the same time, its role in fracturing Palestinian society and creating a lot of different geographies within Palestine itself, or even outside of Palestine itself, whether it's Palestinian citizens of Israel, and various new identifications that emanate from the power to cut, segment, fragment, give privileges to some on the expense of others, exclude and include in all these techniques and dynamics of power that Israel exudes and continues to practice, and the different modalities of control it has practiced historically. So all of that is true. And I think that really emphasizes a large part of our story. And I don't want to say that the Nakba doesn't say anything or we shouldn't, take it seriously. But at the same time, one of the problems of that reading for me, talking about that Nakba, is not only that it confuses disaster and defeat, it's also one that also kind of overemphasizes, our tie to a horizon that is only one that is nightmarish. No, now some people would argue against me and say it's important that we say we live in ongoing Nakba because we need to get away from it. So that's why we're, emphasizing. Or it's important that we talk all the time about Oslo and how catastrophic it was because we're critiquing it and we're overemphasizing and we're inflating it because we want to, how would you express this or articulate it, because we want to get away from it. That's why we're obsessed with power and what power does with us, because we're all the time looking at ways to break free or escape or exceed or fight or fracture this power. That is to some extent true, but I feel that in the intellectual traditions generally there are moments where people tend to overemphasize power because they want to justify not doing anything about it. No, I think, my reading, this is a very superficial reading, but a lot of the French tradition is like that. In its overemphasis, the French theory, like Michel Foucault and others. I'm not saying that they're not rich and they don't have a lot to teach us, and I don't want people to take it as not a nuanced take, but there is an element to it where power does everything, no? And it's like it chokes you, it makes you into who you are, it penetrates your interiority, it creates you as a subject, so and it comes generally after moments of defeat where we overemphasize the extent of power almost as a psychic mechanism to justify either our reluctance to continue with the struggle or to read it perhaps as a relative failure and then continue with other forms or new modes of organization. So instead of looking at it within this kind of totality, perhaps we should change tactics or techniques or look at what mistakes we've done. So there is an element to that. And that's why, like, my vintage point is that we should always, also emphasize not only what power and its techniques and methods do and how catastrophe, for instance, in the Palestinian context is, tied or has this kind of intimate relationship between disaster, catastrophe, and defeat, or catastrophic defeat, as Nakba attempts to connote. But at the same time, in ways that we can emphasize how throughout 133, or I don't know how much it is, 36 years now, of Zionist colonization of Palestine, you still have resistance to it. You still have various forms of resistance being created, experimented with. You have a rich intellectual tradition around that resistance, exavagating. We can do, try to bring the way that resistance had metamorphosed, how it brings memory of the past into contemporary articulation through praxis and through language and through different ways, and how the struggle continues and the struggle of wills continue, including in the great flood of return that we saw from the south to the north, where the Palestinians, knowing all too well what Israel does best, which is it seeks to destroy and annihilate our presence, return to ruins, because they wanted to make the point that this time they will not, leave without returning, that they will return, and that they will return in their hundreds of thousands, as the past couple of days have showed us quite clearly.
100%. And I have to say, I think this is why I enjoy talking to you so much, because I actually have a quite similar perspective on things, and I really appreciate you talking about that. This because what you're talking about within academic discourse um, is a much broader phenomenon too than just Palestine. Like I can see how it plays out in a particular way, but this and I spend a decent amount of time reading stuff like counterinsurgency literature, which is obviously written by people who desire to stop insurgencies, right? They're people who openly identify with colonial history, who openly identify with counter revolution, and things like this. Um, and I read it for the reason of trying to see holes in their thinking, flaws in their thinking, things that could possibly be used by movements against these types of things. And also just to expose what these people say that they want to do, right? And how they say they're going to operate, which I think is important. But I think that one of the things, even within doing that work, or even a lot of the ways that counterinsurgency discussion gets talked about on the left these days, one of the critiques I hear, which I don't think has been fully formed by people making the critique, but they have a point, which is that if we focus on this so much, we're going to present an enemy that appears all powerful to us. We're going to replicate their own narratives of this. And like you said, that point around settler colonial studies largely taking the position or the point of view of the settler, I think is a very important one. And and obviously there's a distinction between settler colonial studies and indigenous studies, but there's certain ways that you can have again that kind of replication of certain things. And I think that, your point about the military aspect missing from analyses, I think is really important. Um, and again, like we could think about military aspects, you could also think about strategies and tactics within movements and things like that. And, analyzing these things. I do think the economic aspect is a good intervention. But yeah, we don't, that point around the cultural lack, or the lack of enlightenment based understandings of uh you know technology and production and so on. I think those are very important points. And I think that there's also this point in sometimes these traditions too that I'm always a little bit wary of like then thinking of resistance in quite nebulous, sometimes even individual kind of terms. And these concepts of like living otherwise, or doing things you know outside of certain dominant paradigms. But again, like part of my problem with this is that in a certain way it becomes kind of individual, kind of neoliberal, and sort of an acceptance of ultimate defeat, right? So I can't confront this power, so then I'm going to live my life differently. And I think that part of what Tufan al-Aqsa shows, and I'm curious of your thoughts on this. I mean, one, speaking on just the military dimension, it seems to be, the most significant phase, perhaps, of the kind of military development of Palestinians that we've seen in that 133-year history, where there's a point reached where they can achieve demands militarily. And I'm not saying that's the only time that that's happened, but there's quite a scale that we're talking about here. Um, and obviously, yeah, this comes with this disaster that has an author that goes well beyond any acceptable understanding of rules of war and engagement and these kinds of things, which of course is typical of colonial entities. Um, yeah, I'm curious, but I think the point is that I wanted to make is that that question of believing that you can win, and then thinking about how do we go about building structures, organizations, collectives strategies, tactics that can get you to a victory, I think is an important aspect. I mean, and it's something that we saw, even if it's not, even if it's not a total victory, and even if maybe it does become a defeat right later on, we don't know the full, we're still in the middle of it. But there are achievements there, and there are capacities there, and that there are possibilities of alliances and support structures regionally and so on, that demonstrate different possibilities than just that things are inevitable defeat, I guess is what I'm saying. So yeah, I don't know if you have anything more you want to say on that, on any of the things I just said.
Well, we're here discussing like social movements and political movements and how they treat this kind of victory and defeat binary, because I think it's sometimes a quite violent binary to impose. One of the tragedies, for instance, of sometimes going through the motions of war, and this is the way you can shift the discourse on, for instance, Tufan al-Aqsa, even. Yes, it opened the horizon. There's a resurgence of Palestine. You can talk about politically, making Palestine a central issue in the region again. You can talk about a lot of different things, and you can build a narrative of victory as well. Ceasefire, prisoners exchange, and Hamas remaining in power, and Israel's total victory. Hubris did not really come into fruition, at least until now. But at the same time, you're doing it while there was like thousands of massacres and a lot of pain and a lot of loss, and people are returning to ruins. So, trying to situate this as a victory and for people to celebrate within this, at this particular exacting moment, also has its own violence, rhetorically and discursively. If you want to impose that on people in Gaza, for instance, who are returning to their homes that are now ruins, or who lost a lot of loved ones, and have no real taste for this whole political conversation around victory and defeat and its importance. But I would emphasize one thing from experience, is that people in movements have at times a tendency, and I'm not saying here about everybody, but in my experience, and here I'm speaking about my personal experience, is that there's a tendency for people who put a lot of lofty goals at the center to be the first ones to leave movements. I don't know why is that, but there is this element of nihilism in terms of fetishizing, or I wouldn't say fetishizing, but placing, these kind of ideal goals at the heart. They're the first ones. Most of the people that I know are the first to exit or leave. In many instances, they're the ones that would be the most radical sometimes, even in terms of the tactics they're proposing or the choices that they're offering in terms of how to move about it. Because they want to perhaps test the waters, or perhaps they want to affirm to themselves that nothing really changes in the world, and that's why they should just go and concern themselves with their own lives and personal salvation and that type of thing. There's a psychic maneuvering there, on some level, and that exists in Palestine in many ways on a collective level, in the sense that defeat has become a psychological corner for many people. It's easier to find certainty in enunciating yourself as somebody who's always defeated, who has always been defeated, and who will always remain defeated. Partially that's the PA project, on an ideological level or psychic level. It attempts to eternalize defeat, and by eternalize the defeat, its only project on some level is to basically ensure that we remain defeated. And that's why it resists resistance and it fights resistance and has this counterinsurgency. But it's important here and fundamental. It's not only, a structure that was imposed from the outside, like many people would read it. Yes, there are economic lubricants going on. Yes, there is an elite capture. Yes, there are Palestinian PLO cater from the bourgeois that sold their soul to the empire and to Israel. It's true, but that doesn't explain how a working class Palestinian becomes a PA officer, and he's used to be also a revolutionary. He was an Israeli person and tortured, and how that kind of development happens, and that kind of psychic shift from being interrogated by an Israeli to working with an Israeli and to interrogating Palestinians in the interrogation room and torturing them. So we need to have a much more complex and nuanced understanding of how that develops and how it evolves and how people are make these kind of shifts. And in defeat on an existential level, there's certainty, because if war is anything, it's this kind of moment of uncertainty. It's a moment where everything could go really terribly bad. Everything you're conducting or you're committed to liberation, but it's still a wager, and wagers could fail, and at the same time, there's no guarantees for anything. There's no guarantees because you successfully, for instance, broke through the wall that separates Gaza from 1948 territories. That means that you're guaranteed, for instance, a state or whatever your goal is. There's no guarantees. You're committing yourself to. You ask yourself, is there a necessity for this war? Whether you should take this decision, and do you have the capacity and the operational capacity of committing this tactic? What is the response of the Israelis could be? What it would be the response of the world? And you have a frame or a look of how this, war could transpire, and that's why you insist, for instance, on taking a lot of Israelis prisoners, because you know that this will cause a discussion within Israeli society, and it would know that a lot of Israelis would want that these prisoners are returned, and that the price of the return of these prisoners would be, the end of the war. Now, maybe you wagered that war would be only 2 months or 3 months as a decision maker, but it turned out to be 15 months. We don't know exactly what went in the minds of the people when they were scenario planning and creating that. But when you open this kind of, or you make this decision, you're opening political possibilities and you're wagering. And you don't have any guarantees. You could have a failure. You could have relative success. You could have relative failure. You can have both. And you can get this kind of muddied, no victory, no defeat type of picture, And that's where we are, We're not, Gaza was not broken. People in Gaza are not feeling defeated in a sense of being broken totally. The mere fact that people are discussing victory and defeat means that we cannot determine if we're victorious or defeated, and not only for political purposes, because there are people with Hamas and with Fatah, but because there are narratives that you can construct based on the factual, empirical reality that we are defeated and that we are victorious, whether you look at whatever metrics that you want to use or whatever narrative you want to construct, which tells you that you're in this condition of no victory, which is the condition that you already live in. But for a lot of people who want to feel defeated, it's easier. There's certainty in it. Nothing ever works. Nothing ever changes. Why should we try? And then I could just continue on with my everyday life. Because what is more dangerous is that you believe in the possibility of victory or overcoming colonialism or changing the form of relationality on the ground or decolonization. You truly believe that that's possible, but you don't do anything about it, or you fight the people who do something about it. The second thing I would say is that for some in Palestine, but also beyond, that they will only believe that victory is possible if it's now. It's like paradise now or salvation now. It has to happen now. So there's this kind of like very short patience, if you want, or sabr in Arabic, if you want, towards what you were trying to articulate earlier, which is, what is the repercussions of this? Did Israel really get away with it, or will it face repercussions in the near future or the medium run? What will happen on the legal front? What will happen with new generations rising and unlearning their Zionism from, and rethinking. Will, and there's many questions here, because again, even on that level, we can be hopeful and we can be very not hopeful, because we can also say Israel was only able to get away with this because that's what today Western powers want. They want a state that break the rules of war, norms around the rules of war, because the West is getting anxious around the rise of China, for instance, and its ability to compete technologically. And that could prove to be the most important and fundamental challenge for this whole Western imperial dominance since at least 500 years. That we're starting to see some sort of power develop that is economically viable, that can compete in technology, that has a military, that has a large population, and that faces the West head on its own terms and defeating it on its own terms. That's one of and there's a growing anxiety around population demographics in the West, around climate change, around the sustainability of the economic system, around the welfare state. So there's all of these concerns and a lot of the anxiety, this kind of aging population and aging empire, and that's part of the description. And that if this West wants to make it through this competition, it will need to use all of its power and unleash it. And Israel is just the first to do that in this century. An example or a model to be emulated in the future. And with the rise of tech bros, with Elon Musk and all of these people, and you have techno-feudalism / Trump / this obscene master that says things that shouldn't be said, but people still celebrate him or not take him seriously, and he wants to take and grab Greenland and wants to return to Panama. So you see signs of that as well. The signs of revisionist powers now are the very powers that set up the system, and they want to revise their system. They want to break the norms and rules that they helped build throughout after the Second World War, and now they're revising these rules and norms. And Israel is one element of that, at least that should be taken seriously, because what happens in Gaza will not stay in Gaza, and will be emulated elsewhere, or will be implemented or enacted elsewhere in different guises and forms. And that's a different reading. I mean, we could be heading to even more deaths, more massacres, and not only the Arab world but beyond that. So in many ways, we can construct these narratives, and that's important. And we can construct narratives around victory and defeat, and we can construct narrative or disentangle defeat from catastrophe and disaster. But one thing that people are uncomfortable with is this kind of position where you're not totally defeated or you're not totally victorious. It's a position where you're still stuck in the need for more energy, more will, in the need to think through the possibilities politically. And in a colonial situation, it's not always in your hands. For instance, it's not just you're being radicalized and you're organizing yourself, because in the colonial situation there's so much violence and it's so in your face, and because there's somebody intended to really eliminate you on a physical level, that political question is a question that moves beyond people who talk about politics or more politicized in specific groups, or have a more political outlook or anything like that. It's a societal issue, and that's why it's easier to just live in the comfy bed of defeat. And in nothing will change. We just move on in our everyday life, and let's not be concerned with the collective dreams and hopes and then the will and the sacrifices needed if we want to actually truly liberate ourselves. And that's why I think defeat is a psychic has a psychic hold over a lot of Palestinians. And it's not because only the life they lead has many signs of defeat, whether it's the expansion of the settlement near them, or the settlers coming on the streets and ruining their life, or our experience of time. As time passes, we see more of our land being annexed, or things like that. And even a lot of analysts made that mistake when they were assessing the war in Gaza. It's like Israel is creating facts on the ground, and therefore there will be settlements, and now it broke in Gaza into two, and it will not concede, and the war will go on. And Hamas maybe should think, I mean, some of them were inferring, not saying it outright, but Hamas maybe should surrender, to prevent that from happening. But eventually that did not even transpire, because that's our experience of time. That's the way time is experienced here, is that the more time passes, the worse it gets. And that's why some of them were like in disbelief when the ceasefire happened, because not everything they kind of promised us in terms of the worst case scenarios unfolded. It could still unfold, and some of them, perhaps just to tell us "I told you so," wants to want it to unfold. But I think in different instances, it was shown that Israel also concedes that its will is not inexhaustible to continue with this war. And it tells us that there's still a human behind the machine that has a will, has a limit to what sacrifices they're willing to expend, has political contradictions, and is defeatable. That's the point of resistance. That's the point of zero distance, is that this intimate engagement between you and the colonizer renders the colonizer human. And because he's human, or she's human, or whatever you want to call the colonizer in this sense, they're defeatable on a political level, defeatable on a historical level, and therefore relations could be changed, and new humanity, as Fanon tells us, could arise.
Yeah, thank you so much. So a couple of other things. There's a few things I do want to touch on. Let's talk a little bit about the prisoner exchanges. One of the figures that was released today was, I may mispronounce this, correct me if I do, Zachariah Zubeidi.
Yeah, we say Zakaria though.
Okay. So
In
just
Arabic.
talk a little bit about, maybe just say a little bit about who he is, and just the significance of some of the prisoners that are being released, for the Palestinian prisoners.
Well, there's a movie that was, it's called Arna's Children. It's about the Jenin refugee camp in the Second Intifada. And for people who want to watch it, I think it's on YouTube. And it's a documentary, and you can see Zakaria in it when he was in the camp in fighting alongside his comrades at a young age. And Zakaria Zubeidi used to be, a youth in the refugee camp who joined the resistance, fought against the Israelis, was arrested in the Second Intifada, and I think pardoned because there was a pardon agreement at some point. I'm not sure about that information, but we should double check it. But he made it out. He became some sort of public / political figure within Fatah. Eventually, I think in 2018 or 17, around that time, he was accused of committing operations using gunfire in various locations within Ramallah. Specifically, he was living in Ramallah, and his son was recently also martyred as part of the Jenin brigades, and he also escaped prison with the people that escaped the prison 2 years ago. So he has this, long, if you want, CV in resistance, and he was, I think, being placed in prison for at least 14 years or 15 years. His sentence, he spent, I think, 5 years of them or something like that, and now he's being freed through the prisoners exchange agreement. Actually, he's living like quite close to my room at this current moment, because they're making it now to Ramallah area. A lot of the prisoners that are being released today from the Ofer prison, which is also near Ramallah. So yeah, I mean that's part of the prisoners. That's one sample of the prisoners that are being released. The prisoners exchange agreement is important, of course. Um, it comes with a hefty price. That's why there's a tamed form of celebration. People feel glad that we see prisoners who have spent years, in some cases decades behind bar, coming out. Some of them are being exiled outside of Palestine. Some of them are returning to their homes and villages in the West Bank or Gaza or Jerusalem. And within the dynamic of seeing joy erupt on the Palestinian streets, I wrote an article in Mondoweiss about this. But the Israelis have decided to close down the West Bank and do this Jenin refugee camp operation that they have been committed to in the past now, I think, a week or so. And committing atrocities in the West Bank now currently to try to appease the settler movement, but also, as we say in Arabic, and as I mentioned in the article, we say tanghis, which is like when you're happy, somebody comes and tries to annoy you or disrupt your joy. And they're attempting that by creating a lot of traffic on checkpoints and humiliating people and leaving them for hours without any window for coming and going from within towns like Ramallah to Nablus, or from the villages around Ramallah to Ramallah, and from Ramallah to around to the villages. So there's all these kind of daily acts of violence that we're used to, and we know that they're doing it to just be like a Grinch in Christmas. It's like that's I think how they view a lot of the pictures and scenery that I have seen. The Zionists looking at the people returning from the south to the north in the hundreds of thousands, looking at the prisoners exchange agreement, looking at their prisoners being happy while being released, and saying bye to the people in Gaza. There's a lot of images now coming out that not only fractures the right wing in Israel's total victory narrative, at least for the moment, but also I think on some level, shifts the inferiority complex. I've always been amazed, because when you read Fanon, usually Fanon emphasizes the way the colonized have some sort of inferiority that develops towards the colonizer. And it's true, but I think there's a lot of the opposite as well. Settlers act, and in the West Bank act in ways that we act. They want to be shepherds, or they want to. So there's all of these kind of nativization and attempts at imitation of the local indigenous population. But beyond these levels, of course, I think there's an inferiority complex because they see the will of people. They see how people, despite all the pain, are not broken. They see how people are willing to sacrifice, how our leaders, lead the military campaign like Yahya Sinwar and get killed and are not opportunistic and corrupt, and their children are not in Miami. They see a lot of these different things, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of jealousy. There's a lot of inferiority that develops among Israelis, not only looking at Palestinians being able to conjure up joy, not conditioning, the government investing millions of shekels, which is a currency in Israel, new Israeli shekel, to return to their homes that are in the north or in the south, in the Gaza envelope, or across the borders from Lebanon. There is a testament to people's will of endurance, ability to withstand this form of monstrosity, being dropped with tons of bombs and explosive. People are estimating it's about 3 nuclear weapons like the ones thrown at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and still people smiling and laughing and putting victory signs. Yes, and I'm not saying that people all feel that way in Gaza. There's a lot of people who might feel differently as well. It's not one picture. There's a lot of pain and crying and loss and feeling of how you will rebuild your life, and feelings of that we live in the horizon of disaster. There's all of these confused feelings and complex feelings coming up at the same time. But yeah, I mean, the Israelis have seen these pictures. They have seen resistance emerge from the underground in the hundreds, wearing full uniforms, having, new cars, clean, conducting these spectacles in the prisoners' exchange, releasing the Israeli prisoners in a methodical way, thinking about the aesthetics of it all, thinking about the spectacle, the image. It's all being, conducted meticulously and at the same time methodically. And there's a lot of show of strength. Some people might say, or some analysts will look, they're showing strength, but it hides a lot of weakness, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It might be true. I don't know. I mean, we don't have a real assessment of how many fighters did the resistance lose, and the leaders, and all the toll that the war took on the resistance itself. And there's not a flux of information coming from the resistance itself on the losses that it incurred, etc. But there is quite a significant, battle of images that I think the Palestinian resistance is being successfully, or is leading successfully, and is winning in many ways. Whether it's for the neutral observer, or whether it's for the observer that is also, with the resistance, but also in launching psychological warfare against Israeli society itself. And the Israelis are looking at this, and not only are they seeing their total victory narrative being fractured, specifically if you're on the right-wing fascists, not only that their hopes for settlements in Gaza are being diminished, if not totally, undone with the fierce resistance that the Israeli forces have faced, but also, seeing the joy on Palestinian faces, and feeling that despite losing a lot of their legitimacy on a global scale, despite the loss of legal impunity with the ICC, issuing warrants for the arrest of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the ex-Minister of Defense Gallant, and with the Hind Rajab Foundation also operating across the world to try and attempt and arrest soldiers who are traveling, and feeling a sense of anxiety about how the world views them, but also a lot of internal contradictions that have to do with their own legal infighting around what legal system they should have, what form of state they need to have. Within the settler society, there are different directions and ideological currents. I think that these images, of Palestinians coming from the ruins with a smile and a victory sign, with these prisoners exchange, is just reaffirming through these pictorial images and spectacles, the extent to which the Palestinian struggle remains alive despite the 15 months, and the way and the ability of the Palestinian to construct both narratives of heroism, endurance, and the desire, the authentic desire of liberation and freedom. And I think that resonates not only among Palestinians, even maybe there's even more fierce discussions among Palestinians about what happened, whether we're defeated or victorious. All of these discussions we're talking about, but also resonates with the globe at large, and resonates with people around the world in various ways. And I think that's, they're jealous, and that's why they want to kill the joy, and that's part of the story of also the prisoner release, because that's one of the actual policies that they use. If prisoners are released to Jerusalem and there's any form of celebration, the police officers are there, they kick people, they arrest family members. And if they've done that in different prison release, in different homes of prisoners being released in the past week, trying to basically, make sure that we're not as happy as we should be for the release of our prisoners.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that on different Western media here too, of when they have Israeli representatives and they get on there and talk about how, no one is allowed to celebrate this. Of course they use the language of terrorism, which is, you know, an absurd projection, but um, it is something that we even see. Um, yeah, and I think that as far as the projections of victory and of I mean, a lot of like the Western, kind of imperialist think tank wonks, I like to call them. I mean, they've written articles and stuff about how Al Qassam was continuing to successfully recruit people to continue to fight even after um, the killing of Yahya Sinwar, and so yeah, I mean, I think that there's not only within Israeli society, but also among the people thinking about U.S. foreign policy and support for Israel, there's at least, if whether it is 100% real or not, like there's a concern there for what they see as the success of the Palestinian resistance and continuing to be able to uh, train new soldiers, bring new soldiers in, and continue to fight. And I think that was part of, as you already said, like kind of the calculus that led to the ceasefire was just a kind of recognition also that the resistance was not did not seem close to being defeated militarily at this point. And at some point, um, the cost for Israel in terms of its own soldiers, or the U.S. in terms of how long they want to continue to provide endless military aid for this and so on. I think those were factors. Um, a couple questions from the audience. So Francis asked, what do you know about Hamas not wanting to run the civil institutions in Gaza and the implications of that for Gaza and West Bank, especially if elections occur? Are you hearing things about this?
No, I mean, the whole issue of reconstruction is tied of Gaza will be tied to, you know, which is, again, this is the first thing that I emphasize in our talks thus far, which is that Israel has many leverage, many points of leverage. The first is, of course, its ability to return to violence, not necessarily invading Gaza or entering areas where its forces could face damage and face killing of more people. But that is also a possibility. But also violence in using air power and standing firepower. In a moment where Palestinians are relieved that the war has ended and would want this ceasefire to continue and become more permanent after tens of thousands killed, hundreds of thousands injured, etc. So that's one element. I think the second element, which is I think also central, is that Israel will hold leverage over the extent and breadth of the reconstruction, since it's the power that surrounds Gaza and is able to dictate what goes in and what doesn't go in. So these are the two elements. And then you have the people who will possibly pay for the reconstruction would be the Gulf Arab regimes, or some of them, and who would also make sure that their money would be contingent on some political compromise from Hamas. So Hamas is in a quite difficult position in terms of being able to enforce its presence for the long term politically in the Gaza Strip, without conceding on some level in order to be able to provision the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, a dire need for many of the people who live in the Strip at this moment, and who would want to see significant reconstruction coming in, economic investment, and the ability to rebuild their lives that they have lost after 15 months of war, many savings were cut off, many people were killed, the return of the healthcare system, the return of education system. It's a lot of things that need to be reworked in many ways. And, it's still an ongoing process. So I think for Americans, for Qataris, for Saudi Arabia, for Egypt, for Israel, this is the point of leverage, and that's why the talk of Hamas willing to give up, governance of Gaza in terms of leading the civil affairs, at least specifically, is, I think, would be a signal from Hamas to these forces that our priority is the reconstruction of the Gaza, and it's not to continue to rule Gaza. But of course, it still remains really difficult to assess, but to what extent they are willing to give up on other elements, which is resistance or the continuation of armed groups or things like that. And this is where it gets more tricky and harder to really reach a compromise, or whether they'll be happy with some sort of arrangement where a technocratic governance authority is based, with them still remaining as a resistance movement that really control decisions around war and peace, and are the real power brokers behind this technocratic government. Will we see elections that unify, between quotes, Hamas and Fatah, or puts them under the same umbrella? And what terms would that unification happen? Because as I mentioned quite earlier in our discussions and throughout these episodes, the only form of unity that is possible is one where either Hamas gives up on resistance and becomes something like Fatah, and it's still possible as an outcome of this war that we will see something like that, maybe, or Fatah and its current leadership changes and changes its direction, and therefore there is some sort of unity around a project of resistance and confrontation and etc. So yeah, that could be. Will we see elections? We will see Fatah or PA forces returning to Gaza. It still remains an open question. I don't think there's a concrete answer, but what at least the ceasefire tells us is that Israel wasn't able by force to completely render Hamas politically unviable, and that whatever choice Hamas makes in the coming months or weeks, it will be a choice that is based on that will have to move through it. So, in other words, it will have to decide which choice it takes. And I think Hamas is in a tough corner, but it's not in an impossible corner, because it doesn't want to antagonize the population further of Gaza after 15 months of war, and it wants the reconstruction. It would be happy to give up on civil affairs because it's a burden. It would happy to see more economic relief to Gaza, and at the same time, it would want to at least retain its resistance movement and its arms in the foreseeable future. That's the equation I will try to come out with. I'm not sure to what extent it will be able to do that successfully. Yeah.
Appreciated. I guess, and this I think is related. There's been some reporting. I haven't delved into this a lot about Saudi-Israeli relations, and the possibility of some kind of, I guess, formal normalization or agreement between the two. Obviously, that would be something that, someone like the US would probably love, because these are its two largest kind of uh, you know, proxies in the region. At the same time, they've always been, the issue of Palestinians has been one that has kept them from, I guess, reaching such a agreement in the past. And, I guess that raises a lot of questions about why that would happen now. And one of the things I saw was that, Saudi Arabia would require some form of Palestinian state recognition. Um, and I don't. So I'm just curious if you're hearing anything about this and what you think about it, I guess.
Well, look, I mean, the question is, what does Saudi Arabia get from normalization? What does Israel get from normalization? And what the Saudis, I think, have on some level seen some sort of relationship with Israel as a strategic necessity in confronting, a growing axis of resistance, in making sure that the United States will back it off at heated moments, and making sure that its system will remain stable and the empire will be there for it, because the empire also ties a lot of the relationship to Saudi Arabia and a lot of these Arab regimes and Arab ruling classes, to the extent and breadth of these Arab ruling classes' willingness to speak to Israel, normalize its relations, normalize it in the Arab world culturally, politically, on media level. And we've seen a lot of that with the Abrahamic Accords and what came in their wake. So there's that question. The Israel's genocidal war in Gaza, has put a lot of weight on the normalization agreements, because it just was so horrific and bloody and monstrous and disgusting in many ways, even for a lot of Arab viewers who were under extreme forms of propaganda that were trying to the extent possible to blame the resistance for what's happening, to make sure that this self-lamenting, self-hating type of rhetoric is the one that is dominant among the Arabs. But despite that, there's still a lot of this war will arouse a lot of I think political rejection to normalization, political rejection towards intimate relations with Israel among the Arab street, if you want, although that's a very Orientalist way of putting it, but among the Arab populations more broadly, And in that light, the Saudis or the cost of normalizing with Israel has just increased, for the Saudi ruling class. So they will want some sort of way to justify it, to make it less problematic for its population. And remember, Saudi Arabia is a bit different than United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, who are small, with a small population. And in the case, for example, United Arab Emirates, where people who are from the Emirates itself are almost all quite well off financially, and have deep ties to the state and its continuation, and trust in its leadership, and who, despite that, don't necessarily like the normalization that United Arab Emirates committed itself to, but at the same time will not risk a confrontation with their own regime on that basis. But in the case of Saudi Arabia, it's a bit different. It's a population of 25 million. It has many classes within different, also Shias and Sunnis, and different classes, a working class and a poor. So there's just much more complexity to Saudi society than in some of the other societies in the Gulf as well. So I think it's possible that we'll see some sort of normalization. I don't think there's anything new, because I think the Saudis already have a relationship with Israel on intelligence level, in terms of meetings secretly. It's just making this kind of secret affair public. And I don't think the Israelis are willing to speak of a Palestinian state in any significant way. Maybe Netanyahu will come out in a speech and say something that is a bit controversial, and just to appease the Saudis for that to happen, or for the normalization to happen. But on a concrete way, I don't think that there's gonna be this kind of two-state solution that some of the ruling classes in the Arab world, or some of the diplomats and political movers and shakers still speak too symbolically. And I doubt that the Saudis are also going to completely reject normalization just because of Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. But I think they'll calculate it. They'll be careful about it. I don't think they necessarily want to rush into it. And if they do rush into it, I think it will come based on a hefty price that they can garner from the Americans and the Israelis in this kind of trade. But I don't think they'll rush into it in to construct this narrative of peace that Trump wants. They might want to give him this gift, but I'm not sure to what extent it will happen as fast as people are saying it will. I might be wrong, but yeah.
No, I appreciate that. The only other comment I had was just that, boy, the children in Miami, like what a strategic locus of all the fascists, fail sons of the world's worst regimes. I mean, it's like, yeah, from reactionary and counter-revolutionary Cubans to, it's just the worst people in the world that have access to Miami. So anyway,
I'm not sure if this is like hate on Miami because maybe I don't know. Maybe you're being
it's
unfair.
Also, yeah, I mean it's true. I have also sports beef with Miami too. So it goes to that direction too.
I sense that. I sense that.
All right. Anything else that you wanted to touch on or get to?
No, I can't really recall anything. No, I'm fine.
All right.
Yeah.
I appreciate this conversation. I look forward to doing it again. I did add the piece that you wrote in Mondoweiss. You write so much stuff, I can't always keep up with everything. I didn't even realize that piece came out the other day. So that's now in the show description. People check that out as well. I'm sure you're not all brainwashed there in Miami, BLK Brew. Sorry, I don't mean to paint you all with the same brush. But
I defended Miami. That should be noted. So.
So also, we'll do this again. This last question from Colin, I do want to highlight. Since the ceasefire, there has been way fewer calls to action in my area. Anyone else seeing the care spigot dry up? This is just a commentary too on something we both referenced that I just would like to underscore again as we close out, which is that people in Gaza are going to need our support just as much, if not more, than what we've been able to do in the past. And so it's really important that folks continue to, whether they form their own mutual aid projects in their communities, whether they support ones that are already existing, like Samir Project, which is run by largely diasporic Palestinians that work with folks in Gaza. Find ways to support those projects where you are. That's a very important thing to continue to do politically, and it will in many ways be a part, I think, as you laid out, Abdaljawad, of determining the long-term horizon here, of what we think of in terms of victory and defeat, because in order to reach victory, we have to for sure ensure that people in Gaza are able to rebuild their lives there, and that's going to require a lot of our support. So anyway, thanks again for this conversation. It's always good to be in dialogue with you.
Thank you, Jared. I'm also happy to be with you anytime.
All right.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.